Last year, this billboard went up in a small town in central Massachusetts. It was a special election for a state legislative seat there in the town of Southbridge, Mass. And this billboard went up on the side of the road. It says, "Show ID," in all caps, which made it look like you had to show a Massachusetts driver's license in order to vote in that election. You do not have to show a Massachusetts driver's license in order to vote in Massachusetts. But this billboard sure makes it look like it, doesn't it? A few months later, in New Bedford, Mass., there was another special election. Voters inside the polling place in New Bedford were treated to the side of these guys. It's a former Massachusetts Republican candidate and a friend from the Tea Party, sitting in suits and ties at an official-looking table with an official-looking sign. The sign says, "Show ID to vote." And then underneath that, it's got some rules listed. Rules. Have valid government-issued ID. And then it says some more stuff. And then the last rule, voluntary compliance. Oh, right, I see. This isn't actually a rule at all. It's just a couple of guys trying to make you think it's a rule by sitting there looking all official with that sign while you're trying to vote. After that election, the Massachusetts Secretary of State, in fact, ruled that it was illegal for those guys to be inside that polling place with their big sign that says, "Show ID to vote." But by that time, the election was over, and so maybe the damage was done, right? We don't know how many people rolled past that billboard in Southbridge and decided they wouldn't turn out to vote because they didn't have a driver's license. We don't know how many people walked into that polling place in New Bedford thinking they would vote, saw that big sign that said they were going to have to show a valid government-issued ID in order to vote, knew they didn't have that in their pocket, and then they turned around and walked out. We don't know. I mean, yeah, it was a factually inaccurate claim both on the billboard and on that sign. Yeah, it was illegal even for those guys to be there inside that polling place making that claim. But you know what? Hey, the damage was done. If the point of requiring documentation to vote is that not everybody has it, and so therefore you winnow out of the electorate folks who are not likely to have that documentation, well, people who are interested in protecting the vote may be able to stop you from changing the law in order to do that, right? But think about it. What's the next best thing? Maybe you can't win legally, but maybe you can still get the word out. If you can at least be confusing enough about it, then maybe you can forget the law. Your strategy might work anyway. You might winnow people out of the electorate anyway by virtue of intimidation or at least confusion. Here's how it works in the great state of Mississippi. In the great state of Mississippi this past November, a referendum passed that said people wouldn't be able to vote in that state anymore unless they showed documentation that many thousands of Mississippi residents do not have. Well, yesterday, the Department of Justice told Mississippi that given the special scrutiny that state earned under the Voting Rights Act for many years of suppressing the black vote, given that special scrutiny, the Justice Department said no to this new proposed law in Mississippi. Or at least they said not yet. This law is at least not going to be in effect for the November election in Mississippi. You're not going to have to show ID in order to vote in Mississippi. Right, the worry here was that because thousands of Mississippi legal voters don't have the ID that would have been necessary under the new law, this new law would have kept disproportionate numbers of those voters who happen to be poor people and minorities and elderly people and students from voting on Election Day. Well, that law has now technically been blocked by this Justice Department letter. But what if you could still get that impact on the electorate anyway? How would you want to do that, right? Well, this is what the Mississippi Secretary of State, who's a Republican, has been doing all summer long in that state. He's been printing up and posting 1,000 signs all across the state that say voter ID in big letters with a big number to call if you need ID, which, by the way, you don't need to vote in Mississippi. Bless his heart. Mississippi's Republican Secretary of State spent the summer talking up the state's new law and sending out postcards all over the state about this new ID. You're going to need to vote, even though that is not the law in Mississippi. To be clear, if you do not have ID, it is still okay for you to vote in Mississippi this year. But you would never know that from the way the state's top elections official has been spending your tax dollars to advertise to you that if you don't have an ID, stay away from the polls. It's not the law, but hey, if you keep saying it over and over again, it might work anyway, right? In Pennsylvania today, we got a court ruling on the Republican change to voting laws there. That would make voting very much harder in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's law was the strictest in the nation. It was thought to have potentially the largest impact on the presidential election this year. I mean, to the extent that Pennsylvania it really is a swing state, the proportion of voters who would have been affected by this voter ID law there is sort of staggering. There are roughly 8 million registered voters in Pennsylvania. Estimates of the number of Pennsylvania residents who wouldn't be allowed to vote under this new Republican law in that state ranged as high as 1.3 million. So of Pennsylvania's 8 million, More than 1 million of them are just not going to be allowed to vote under this rule change? No wonder Pennsylvania Republicans thought this was going to be such a big deal.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
Yeah, make voting harder? Done. And that's going to allow Mitt Romney to win our state. Well, today, the judge who had originally upheld Pennsylvania's new law sort of quashed it. I mean, technically, he did quash it, and this ought to be the most important thing, right? The bottom line here in Pennsylvania is that as of this judge's ruling today, you do not have to have a driver's license or another form of government-issued photo ID. You can still vote in the election this November if you're a legal voter, even if you don't have that ID. That part of the law has been struck down. So hundreds of thousands of old people and poor people and students and people who just live in Philly and take public transportation and who therefore don't have a driver's license, hundreds of thousands, maybe more than 1 million Pennsylvania legal voters who were going to be blocked from voting from this new Republican law are now going to be allowed to vote. But conveniently for the people who were trying to stop them from voting, this judge left a couple of things still intact. First, the judge made clear that poll workers can still ask people if they've got ID anyway. Even though it's not legally required for you to have an ID in order to vote, he says the poll worker can still ask you. So if you don't have an ID, the poll worker asks you, they're supposed to let you go ahead and vote even after you say, no, I don't have an ID. Think there's any chance there's going to be confusion around that? Think that's going to be confusing for any poll worker? Any poll worker might not understand how that conversation is supposed to go. Think there might be any hang-ups? Think that might be confusing for any voters who get asked that question? Think that request might turn any voters around so they end up not voting that day? But here's the best part. Pennsylvania's Republican governor back in the day, when they got this law passed, hired a Republican fundraiser to create an ad campaign that was supposed to teach voters about the state's new restrictions on voting. A multi-million-dollar ad campaign to the people of Pennsylvania, broadcasting literally that if you do not have an ID, if you don't have one of these, don't bother showing up to vote. That is not the law in Pennsylvania. The law is you can show up even if you don't have this ID. You are allowed to vote. They tried to change the law. They could not get away with it. What about that ad campaign? Depending on how those conversations with the poll workers go and how long those ads stay up, hey, they may not have gotten away with changing the law, but it might just work anyway to keep all of those people without IDs away from the polling place. The people who are fighting the new law in the first place are now asking the judge to quash the ad campaign, too. The Secretary of State's office says that they're looking into the matter. You know, the mechanics of the election are upon us now. This was Ohio today. Yes, those are tents people were sleeping in because early in-person voting started in Ohio today and people slept out to be first in line. First Lady Michelle Obama was in Ohio today not just to persuade people and try to inspire people to vote for her husband, but to persuade them to go do so right this second, which people in Ohio could do starting today. In most of the swing states, early voting is happening already. And yeah, the campaigns are still trying to persuade people, and there's the debate tomorrow. But we are now into it. We are into the mechanics of how the election is run. And in some ways, how the election is being run and how the campaign's prepared for it looks a little bit desperate for the Republican Party right now. I mean, we learned that as of yesterday, the Republican Party has ended all of their new voter registration efforts in Colorado, Virginia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Florida, all critically important swing states. The Republican Party had hired a single scandal-ridden company to register voters in all those key states, and now they have fired that company after it appeared to be turning in fraudulent forms for registering voters. The same company had been planning get-out-the-vote campaigns for the Republican Party in Ohio and Wisconsin before the Republican Party cut all ties to the firm. So if you're a Republican partisan who wants Mitt Romney to win, you have to be concerned about this political reality, that voter registration has been stopped by your party in those swing states well before the voter registration deadline. But if you are a person who's actually worried about voter fraud, not just for partisan reasons, right, but if you're worried about the possibility of voter fraud, you now have to worry about this group's history that was hired by the RNC, about whether they have done something that is going to prevent votes from being counted. Not fake votes, but real votes. In previous elections, this is a group that is alleged to have gotten progressives, liberals, would-be Democrats to sign up to vote and then thrown away the registration forms of those voters who signed up as Democrats. Did that happen? This group has been fired now, and they are very ashamed, and they say they're very sorry. But given what they were accused of in the past, how much damage has been done? Might it work to suppress the vote anyway? Now, with today's ruling, the list of states where Republicans tried to change the law to block hundreds of thousands of legal voters from being able to cast ballots. The number of states where Republicans have tried that and been blocked by the courts includes Wisconsin, Texas, Florida, Arizona, South Carolina, Ohio, and now Pennsylvania and Mississippi, back to back. The courts have stepped in. In all of those places, Republicans have tried to change the law, and they've not been able to. But how do you quantify how much damage was done anyway? Joining us now is the president of America Votes, Joan Fitz-Gerald. She's a former state county clerk in Jefferson County, Colorado, and a former Colorado state senator. She ran for Congress in 2007 and lost the Democratic primary to Congressman Jared Polis there. Joan Fitz-Gerald, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
In an earlier election, the voter registration firm that the Republican Party just fired in all these states, they are accused of impersonating the group you now lead, this group America Votes, which is obviously a Democratic-leaning, left-leaning progressive group. The firm was accused back then of courting new progressive voters, most of who were going to sign up as Democrats, and then tearing up those registrations. How did you and how does your group quantify the damage from something like that?
It's really hard to quantify. That was back in 2004. And as you said, this year, all of this talk about voter suppression actually creates an environment that does suppress the vote, even if you don't pass the legislation or the legislation's not enacted. And we know that from studies that have been done. You're setting up barriers to people, even real or imagined, that prevent people from going to the polls and exercising, importantly, a constitutional right.
So even in these cases where the efforts to change the voting rules have been turned back by the courts, like we saw today in Pennsylvania, even in states where it's been fought over but the voter suppressive side has not won, you're saying that there is sort of a knock-on effect of people hearing about that and believing they will be blocked from voting?
Yes, and there's confusion. There's confusion with people who work at the polls. There's confusion with the voters. What do I need when I go? I've seen these signs. As you said, the ad campaign is continuing in Pennsylvania. So people are going to be confused, even if the law was blocked by the courts, saying they didn't have enough time to get voter ID to all the people that needed it. Apparently, a much larger number than the General Assembly was willing to admit in Pennsylvania.
Well, what's the cure to that? What's the way to fight that? Obviously, part of fighting that is winning the legal case. But if that's not enough, how do you win the rest of the battle?
We had always assumed that the law would be enacted, and so we went to the extent of trying to find ways to get people ID because we were going to assume that they needed it. And frankly, there were enough groups that could help in a presidential year. This now has been postponed to 2014, a gubernatorial year, and there won't be that kind of help. So we're going to continue to try and get people the voter ID that will eventually be required in Pennsylvania.
Wow. And when you think about the different levels of sort of news awareness of all the different people you have to reach, it can't just be through the news media. It's an incredible education effort underway.
It's enormous.
Joan Fitz-Gerald, president of America Votes, former county clerk and state senator in Colorado. I'd love to talk to you more about this. Would you come back and join us again?
I'd love to.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. All right, more news and an important programming update for you still to come. Stay tuned.